You know, something I've noticed over all these years watching people prepare for retirement is that most folks spend their entire lives trying to acquire things, and then they spend their retirement years trying to figure out what to do with all those things they acquired. It's one of those quiet ironies that nobody really talks about at dinner parties or financial planning seminars. We're told to build wealth, to accumulate assets, to diversify our holdings and create multiple streams of income. And that's not wrong advice necessarily. But what I've observed is that somewhere along the way, we forget to ask ourselves a very simple question. What is all of this actually for? I've had the privilege of watching thousands of people transition into retirement over the decades, some of them millionaires, many times over, and some of them with modest savings, but comfortable nonetheless. And I'll tell you what I've learned. The amount of money people have often matters far less than the relationship they have with their money and with their possessions. The folks who seem most at peace in their later years aren't usually the ones with the biggest portfolios or the most properties. They're the ones who figured out early on that freedom and simplicity are worth more than any asset you can put on a balance sheet. Now, let me talk about something that might surprise you. The idea that you need to hold on to everything you've built, that you need to keep every investment, every property, every business interest right up until the end. I've watched smart, capable people carry these enormous loads well into their 70s and 80s because they believed that letting go somehow meant they failed or gave up or lost the game. But here's what I've come to understand. The game changes when you stop working. The rules that helped you build wealth are not the same rules that help you enjoy wealth. And that's a distinction most people never make until it's too late. Let me start with something most people consider their greatest asset and their safest investment, the house they live in. Now, I'm not going to tell you to sell your home if you love it and it brings you joy and you can afford it without stress. But I am going to ask you to think clearly about what that house actually costs you. Not just the mortgage, if you still have one, but the property taxes that go up every year, the insurance premiums, the maintenance that gets more expensive as the house gets older, the utilities for rooms you don't use anymore, the lawn service or the hours you spend yourself pushing a mower around a yard that's bigger than you need, the repairs that always seem to come at the worst time. I've seen people hold on to large family homes for decades after their children moved out because of emotional attachment, or because they thought it was a good investment, or because they simply couldn't imagine living anywhere else. And I understand that attachment. I really do. But what I've also seen is those same people become servants to their houses instead of the other way around. They spend their retirement years maintaining a property that requires constant attention and money when they could be free to travel or pursue interests or simply relax without worrying about the next repair bill. There's a simple piece of math that most people don't do. Take the value of your home and imagine you sold it for something smaller or more manageable. Let's say you free up $200,000 or $300,000 in equity. Now imagine that money invested conservatively generating 4 or 5% a year. That's $10,000 to $15,000 annually that could cover your rent in a nice apartment or a smaller home with no maintenance responsibilities. And you still have your principal intact. But beyond the math, there's something even more valuable. There's freedom. Freedom from worry about storm damage and roof replacements and whether you'll be able to navigate those stairs in 10 years. Now, let me talk about cars. Most people don't think of vehicles as a major retirement consideration, but I've seen this pattern repeat itself over and over. People retire with 2 or 3 cars in the garage. Maybe one is a truck they barely use. Maybe one is a sports car they bought during a midlife moment. Maybe they just always had 2 cars because that's what couples do. But here's what happens. Those cars sit there depreciating. They require insurance and registration and maintenance, whether you drive them 5,000 miles a year or 15,000 miles a year. Each one is a small constant drain on your resources and your mental energy. I knew a fellow who retired with 3 vehicles, a sedan, a pickup truck, and an SUV. He told me he needed all 3 for different purposes. The sedan for daily driving, the truck for hauling things to the dump twice a year, the SUV for bad weather. When I asked him how much he spent annually keeping all 3 vehicles insured and maintained, he had never actually calculated it. When he did the math, it was close to $7,000 a year for 3 vehicles that collectively sat in his garage more than 90% of the time. He eventually sold 2 of them, and you know what he told me? He said he felt lighter. Those were his exact words, lighter, like he'd been carrying something heavy he didn't realize was weighing him down. The same principle applies to vacation homes, and I know this is a sensitive topic because vacation properties often represent dreams we worked hard to achieve. That cabin by the lake or the condo at the beach or the mountain retreat. These places hold memories, and we tell ourselves we're creating value for our families and building equity. And maybe we are. But we also need to be honest about what these properties actually cost us, not just financially, but in terms of time and energy and worry. Every vacation home is essentially a second full-time commitment. It needs maintenance and upkeep and attention. You pay property taxes and insurance and utilities year-round for a place you might use a few weeks annually. You worry about pipes freezing in the winter or storm damage or whether renters are taking care of the place if you rent it out to offset costs. You spend your actual vacation time doing chores and repairs instead of relaxing. And then there's the guilt when you don't use it enough to justify the expense. I've watched families split apart over inherited vacation properties because nobody wants to sell the place that holds all those memories, but nobody wants to pay for its upkeep either. The property becomes a burden dressed up as a blessing. And here's the thing about vacation homes that nobody wants to admit. You can rent beautiful places in beautiful locations for far less than owning costs you when you account. All the hidden expenses. You can go somewhere different every year. You can travel the world instead of returning to the same spot out of obligation to a mortgage and maintenance schedule. But we don't think this way because we've been taught that ownership is always better than renting and that real estate is always a good investment. Now let me talk about something that makes even experienced investors uncomfortable: portfolio concentration, particularly in retirement. I've seen too many smart people retire with the majority of their wealth tied up in 1 or 2 investments. Maybe it's company stock from the firm they spent their career building. Maybe it's rental properties in one geographic area. And maybe it's a small business they poured their lives into. And they believe that because these investments did well for them over the years, they'll continue to do well. But concentration is a young person's strategy. When you're building wealth, you can afford to take concentrated risks because you have time to recover if things go wrong. When you're living off your wealth, you need stability and diversification more than you need the possibility of extraordinary returns. The executive who retires with 80% of his net worth in his former company's stock is taking an enormous risk he probably doesn't recognize. If that company struggles or faces an industry downturn or makes a strategic mistake, his retirement security evaporates, and it happens more often than people think. I've watched it happen to people who worked at companies everyone thought were invincible. The person who owns multiple rental properties in the same city is betting everything on that local economy and real estate market continuing to thrive. What happens if major employers leave town, or if property values decline, or if regulations change making rentals less profitable? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're risks that become realities for somebody every single year. Diversification feels boring. It feels like you're settling for average returns when you could be getting exceptional returns from that one investment you know so well. But diversification isn't about maximizing returns in retirement. It's about ensuring you can sleep at night and maintain your lifestyle regardless of what happens to any single investment or sector or geographic region. It's about trading the possibility of getting rich for the certainty of staying comfortable. And when you're 70 or 80 years old, that's not a compromise, that's wisdom. Business ownership is another area where I see people struggle with letting go. They built something from nothing. They created jobs and served customers and took pride in their work. And now retirement approaches and they can't imagine selling or closing or handing off something that defined their identity for so long. I understand this deeply. A business often feels like a child you raised, but businesses require constant attention and energy in decision-making. They create stress even when they're successful, especially when they're successful. And the question you have to ask yourself honestly is whether you want to spend your retirement years managing employees and dealing with customer complaints and worrying about competition and regulation and all the things that come with business ownership. Some people tell themselves they'll step back and hire someone to run things while they collect the profits. And occasionally that works. But more often what happens is they can't truly let go. They interfere and second guess and undermine the person they hired because it's still their business and their reputation and their money on the line. Or the business struggles without their daily involvement because their knowledge and relationships and instincts were the actual assets, not the business itself. And they end up back in the office working harder than they planned, or watching their business value decline, or dealing with the stress of shutting down something they worked so hard to build. The smarter path for most people is to sell while the business still has value and you still have energy. Take the chips off the table, diversify that wealth, free yourself from the daily obligations. Let someone younger with more energy and hunger take it to the next level. You already proved what you needed to prove. You already built what you needed to build. Now it's time to enjoy the fruits of that labor rather than continuing to tend the orchard. There's a pattern I've noticed with people who successfully transition into retirement with peace and contentment. They learn to distinguish between assets that serve them and assets that they serve. An asset that serves you generates income or appreciation or utility without requiring constant attention and stress. An asset that you serve demands your time and energy and worry and money. The trick is recognizing which is which and having the courage to let go of the things that are costing you more than they're worth. This applies to physical possessions too. Collections of things we thought had value, antiques and memorabilia and items we've held on to because they might be worth something someday. I've watched people's children and grandchildren inherit boxes and garages full of stuff that meant something to the person who collected it, but means nothing to the next generation. It all ends up donated or sold or thrown away anyway. So why carry the burden of storing and insuring and worrying about it for years? Why not simplify now while you can still enjoy the freedom that comes from having less to manage? One of the most valuable lessons I've learned from watching people age is that peace of mind becomes more precious than almost anything else. When you're young, you can handle complexity and stress and juggling multiple responsibilities. Your body and mind can manage it. But as you age, that capacity diminishes, not because you lose your sharpness necessarily, but because you simply have less energy and less tolerance for chaos and complication. The people who thrive in retirement are the ones who simplified their financial lives before they reached a point where complexity became overwhelming. Think about it this way. Every single thing you own and every single investment you hold requires at least a small amount of mental energy. You have to track it and maintain it and make decisions about it and worry about it at least occasionally. Now multiply that by dozens or hundreds of things and investments, and you start to see why some people spend their retirement years feeling exhausted and anxious instead of peaceful and free. They built this enormous infrastructure of possessions and holdings thinking it would provide security, but instead it provides burden. The math of simplification is straightforward. Fewer possessions mean lower costs for storage and insurance and maintenance. Fewer properties mean less time and money spent on upkeep and taxes. Fewer investments in your portfolio mean lower advisory fees and less to monitor and simpler tax returns. Fewer vehicles mean less insurance and registration and depreciation. All of this adds up to more money in your pocket and, more importantly, more time and energy for the things that actually matter to you. But beyond the math, there's something deeper happening. When you simplify, you create space in your life, space for relationships and experiences and rest and reflection. You stop being a manager of things and start being a person who enjoys life. You trade maintainer, NCE for meaning. And that shift is worth more than any asset on your balance sheet. I think one reason people resist this simplification is that they equate letting go with losing. They think if they sell the vacation home or downsize their house or reduce their possessions, they're somehow admitting defeat or going backwards. But that's not what's happening at all. What's actually happening is a natural progression. You spent the first half of your life acquiring and building and accumulating. That was appropriate for that season. Now you're entering a different season. A season where the goal isn't to have more, but to need less, where success isn't measured by the size of your portfolio, but by the quality of your days, where wealth isn't about impressing others, but about having the resources and freedom to live according to your own values and desires. There's a concept I've always found useful. The idea that true wealth is measured not by how much you have, but by how little you need. When you need less, you have more options. You have less anxiety about market volatility or unexpected expenses. You can be more generous with others because you're not worried about protecting an increasingly complex empire of assets. You can take risks on experiences and relationships because your baseline is simple and manageable. This is the paradox that takes most people decades to understand. The more you simplify, the wealthier you actually feel, regardless of the size of your bank account. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting you live like a monk or give away everything you own or stop enjoying the comforts that money can provide. That's not wisdom. That's just a different kind of extreme. What I'm suggesting is that you take an honest inventory of your life and ask yourself some hard questions. Does this asset make my life better or more complicated? Am I holding on to this because I genuinely value it or because I think I'm supposed to? Is this investment serving my retirement goals, or is it a holdover from a different life stage with different priorities? Am I confusing net worth with self-worth? Am I using possessions and properties to avoid dealing with deeper questions about what I actually want from my remaining years? These aren't easy questions, and the answers are different for everyone. Some people genuinely love maintaining their large home and find joy in yard work and repairs. Some people use their vacation property constantly, and it brings their family together regularly. Some people have businesses that practically run themselves and generate income without stress. I'm not here to tell you what to keep and what to let go. I'm here to tell you to think clearly about these things without letting emotion or ego or what other people think cloud your judgment. The emotional side of financial decisions becomes more important as we age, not less. When you're young, you can afford to make mistakes driven by emotion because you have time to recover. When you're older, those emotional decisions can derail decades of careful planning. I've seen people refuse to sell a losing investment because it would mean admitting they made a mistake. I've seen people hold on to properties they can't afford because selling would feel like failure. I've seen people stay in businesses that are draining them because their identity is wrapped up in being a business owner. All of these are emotional decisions disguised as financial decisions, and they're costly in ways that go far beyond money. The discipline required for a successful retirement is different from the discipline required to build wealth. Building wealth requires sacrifice and delayed gratification and focused intensity. Enjoying wealth requires letting go and accepting and having the courage to simplify even when it feels like you're giving something up. Both require discipline, but they're very different kinds of discipline. Most people master the first kind and never learn the second. They spend their whole lives climbing a mountain, and then they don't know what to do when they reach the summit except keep climbing, even though there's nowhere left to go. What I've come to believe after all these years is that retirement done well is about subtraction, not addition. It's about removing the things that complicate your life so you can focus on the things that enrich it. It's about having enough, but not too much. It's about creating a financial structure that's simple enough that you can understand and manage it, even if your mental sharpness declines. It's about building in margins so that unexpected expenses or market downturns don't create panic or force you to change your lifestyle. It's about positioning yourself so that you're running towards something meaningful rather than running away from financial anxiety. The people I've known who seemed most content in their later years all had this in common. They reached a point where they stopped keeping score. They stopped comparing themselves to others. They stopped trying to maximize every dollar and optimize every decision. They found a level of simplicity and security that felt right for them. And then they shifted their focus entirely to relationships and experiences and contribution and meaning. They still paid attention to their finances, but money became a tool for living well rather than a scorecard for measuring success. This kind of contentment doesn't just happen. It requires making deliberate choices that might feel counterintuitive or even uncomfortable in the moment. It requires letting go of things you worked hard to acquire. It requires admitting that some of the goals you chased for decades might not actually matter anymore. It requires redefining what success means at this stage of your life. These are hard transitions for most people because we're not taught to think this way. We're taught to acquire and achieve and advance. We're not taught how to be satisfied. We're not taught how to simplify. We're not taught that sometimes the best financial decision is the one that results in less, not more. So here's what I'd encourage you to think about as you approach or navigate your retirement years. Look at your life with fresh eyes. Pretend you're starting from scratch today and ask yourself what you would choose to have if you were building your life now. How many homes would you want to manage? How many vehicles would you need? How complicated would you want your investment portfolio to be? What possessions would you choose to own and maintain? What commitments would you take on? I suspect if you're honest, the life you design today looks quite different from the life you're actually living. That gap between what you have and what you choose is where your opportunities for simplification lie. And understand that this process takes time. You don't have to sell everything tomorrow or make dramatic changes all at once, but you can start moving in the direction of simplicity and freedom. You can start asking better questions and making more intentional decisions. You can start letting go of the things that no longer serve you. You can start building the retirement you actually want instead of the one you think you're supposed to have. In the end, what we're really talking about is freedom. Freedom from worry, freedom from complexity, freedom from the burden of managing more than we need, freedom to focus on what actually matters in these years we have left, because that's what retirement should be, not an ending, but a beginning, not a retreat, but an advancement toward a simpler, more intentional, more meaningful way of living, not a time to protect everything you've accumulated, but a time to enjoy the fruits of your labor without being weighed down by the machinery that produced them. The greatest gift you can give yourself in retirement is the peace that comes from knowing you have enough, that your life is manageable and your finances are simple and your days are your own, that you're not serving your possessions, but your possessions are serving you, that you've built a life where there's margin and flexibility and room to breathe. That's real wealth. That's real success. That's what all those years of work were actually for.